Hello everyone, I'm English Grandmaster Guy Jones, and welcome to this short and sweet on the King's Indian. Now this is an edited highlight package of my longer course, the Lifetime Repertoire King's Indian Defense Part 1. And so if you're interested in mating your opponent, as we'll see here, please consider going over there and checking out the full course. Here we'll cover White's approaches where he occupies the center immediately, with d4, c4, knight c3, and e4, and then either knight f3 with the main lines, the classical, the Gligorich, the Petrosian, and the Mechanigoff with h3, and also the Samish, where White instead plays f3. We'll jump straight in and have a sneak peek behind the scenes. So we have our typical King's Indian development. Big advantages, we can play this knight f6, g6, bishop g7 against everything. This course will see e4. Remember, we weren't interested in playing d5. This isn't a Grunfeld. We're going for our structure, and we're going to fight back in the center, our hypermodern opening. And first of all, let's check out knight f3 and bishop e2, the classical variation. Now here, I'll give two choices. There's the main line with e5 and knight c6, which we'll cover in depth. I'll also look at my pet variation of knight bd7. This can either be played now or after e5 castle. The big advantage of playing it immediately is it cuts out quite a lot of White's options, the Petrosian and the Gligorich for starters, and also the annoying exchange variation. White's not going to be able to just exchange queens here. We're keeping all the pieces on the board for a full fight. White tends to castle. In 95% of my games, White has just castled here. And after e5, White has a choice. The main lines that we'll examine subsequently, the knight is on c6, which means there's a bit more pressure on the pawn on d4. But d5 comes with tempo, forcing our knight back. Here, White doesn't really want to play d5 because it gives away a nice big square on c5 for our knight, which is obviously more active there than on e7. White's by far main move in practice is bishop e3, when I suggest playing queen e7. Now, we're not yet threatening to win a pawn with e takes d4 and knight takes e4, but it's on the cards, and we threaten to threaten it. We want to force White to close the center with d5, and we're going to block up the queen side and then go and attack on the king side. It doesn't make so much difference whether White plays d5 here or first plays a couple of waiting moves. We're going to react in the same way. For example, this gives White an extra couple tempi. After h6, we are now threatening knight g4, and so White really does need to act. If he continues on autopilot, as a couple of my Grandmaster opponents have done with rook fe1, then knight g4 is really annoying. White never wants to lose this dark square bishop. If he does, he has problems on both sides of the board. Long term, our bishop on g7 will be wonderful, and White really struggles to get any attack on the queen side without that bishop. So it has to go back to c1, but now captured on d4. The automatic knight takes d4 is actually a mistake. White does better to offer the exchange with rook takes. But what could be more natural than taking with the knight? But now we crash through. Knight takes f2, has to be taken. Queen h4 check. I've actually had this position twice against Grandmasters in competitive tournament games. The most recent being in the European Online Blitz against a strong German Grandmaster, Wagner. I won this game, which helped me qualify for the final, and I went on to win the tournament. So I can put it down to the King's Indian. White has a big problem here. Simply dropping back to g1 allows bishop takes d4 check, and it can't be taken because the rook is hanging on e1. Similarly, king f1 would fail. This was Dennis Wagner's choice, but after bishop takes d4, we threaten mate, and when it's recaptured, queen f6 check, forks king and rook, and we end up the exchange in a pawn. It took me a while without I didn't display perfect technique in the blitz game, but I got there in the end and qualified. Alternatively, White could try g3, but now after taking on h2, I believe that this is how my first game went, but unfortunately here, I couldn't find the kill. It's a very pretty move. We need to get this bishop on g7 involved in the game. And so h5. The threat is bishop h6 check, and whichever way the king goes, knight e5 will be mate. And White just doesn't have a defense. His pieces are too congested. Finally, king e3 tries to hold on to the material, but now we can take on d4 check. King takes is forced. If you take with the rook, then the one on e1 is hanging again. But now queen f2 check. It can be blocked, but we continue checking. It looks like white is almost safe. He's developed his bishop. The king's getting ready to go to c1, but knight takes c4 check exploits the new pin. We win the bishop on e3 with material up, and we're still attacking. So rook fe1 is a big mistake, but one that is quite easy for white to stumble into. He doesn't see any danger. Instead, white should close it. And this structure appears in so many different variations in the knight bd7 line. So if you don't mind playing this structure, then you should definitely check out knight bd7 as an alternative to the main lines. We could have it, if white had pushed immediately with d5, with this pawn back on h7, white's queen back on d1, and the rook on a1. This is probably a better version for white, as he's sort of gained some time, but it's not clear if the rook is good or bad on d1, because if white wants to break on the queen side with rook b1 and b4, then he'll lose the tempo back. The key thing to remember here is to maintain this bind on the queen side. The pawn on c5 is doing a great job. In all these classical lines, white is trying to get in c4, c5 to activate this bishop on e2 that at the moment is pretty lousy. Give a square for his knight to hop round to c4 and try and put pressure on our pawn on d6. None of that is possible if we keep a pawn on c5. And so even the bishop on e3 now is just sort of blocked in by our pawn. It's not fulfilling any role. So it's quite difficult for white to actually find any play over on the queen side. In the vast majority of my games, white has tried to get somewhere with the usual classical moves, knight e1 to d3 or knight d2, a3 and b4, but you can just react with b6, keep it nice and solid, and white's not getting anywhere. In the meantime, we'll play over on the king side. As we played h6, we'll probably play knight h7 and f5 as a way to get in this break. If the pawn were back on h7, then instead we would go for a plan of king h8 and knight g8. This has dual purpose. We're prepared to play f5. Once again, it's the break. The king is safe on h8. It's generally the best square for it. And we also have an idea of exchanging bishops with bishop h6 as the pawn is back on h7. Here, we'll just see the most critical line for white, which is g3. It looks really odd to move a pawn in front of your own king, but it shows very good understanding here. White tries to exploit our pawn being on h6. His idea is to go knight h4 when it's a bit difficult to get in the f5 break because our g6 pawn will be hanging. But we'll follow the very high-class game between Boris Gelfand, who was playing for a World Championship match not that many years ago, and another Israeli Grandmaster, Ilya Smirin, who is really a King's Indian specialist, and I urge you to check out his games. He's played many creative, wonderful brilliancies. So he played knight back to h7. The idea is f5. This break is key in the King's Indian in general. It's what we want. We want a pawn storm, attack white's king and mate him. But knight h4 slows us down a bit. We can't go f5 because the pawn hangs. So we have to play it a bit more slowly with knight g5, still pointing the pieces towards white's king. In the course, I mentioned that perhaps knight h4 isn't actually the most accurate move here, but it's certainly the most logical once you play g3. So the knight jumps in. Boris Gelfand decides that actually the extra tempo of rook g1 isn't very helpful with the center closed, and so he returns to trying to play on the queen side and open up lines. Smirin jumps his knight around, b4, and here, normally I'm suggesting b6 in the course just to keep this stronghold on pawn on c5. Smirin is a strong enough GM to know when to break the rules. He takes. He's going all out for the attack over on the king side. After rook takes, once again, b6 would be a decent alternative, just stopping c5 and slowing white up. But he goes for the kill with knight g4, attacking the bishop on e3. Boris Gelfand decides he doesn't want to waste time dropping the bishop back, and he'd have problems on f2 with the other knight hopping into h3 check. Also, ideas of knight f4 check after the king goes up to g2, because the knight on h4 would be hanging. So he takes. After bishop takes g4, f3, bishop h3, white had some big problems on the light squares. White continued logically with rook fb1, attacking the pawn on b7. So b6, a4. Now it's a pure race. If white gets time to play a5, get rid of our pawn on b6, rook enter on b7, we'll have weak pawns on a7 and a5. White will play c5 to break through or win our pawn on d6. And that d and c pawns will just march on. We won't be able to mate. And we'll be in a lot of trouble. We're strategically lost. But it's our move first. It's all about tempi. f5 was a brilliant move. Now, of course, this allows knight takes g6, winning the exchange, but we get take on f3 with check. And here, unfortunately, Ilyas Mirin goes the wrong way with his queen. If he'd played queen f7, he would have been well on his way to victory. The point is that we want to go to h5 with the queen. This is the best square for it. For example, take the rook, take on f5. If you don't take on f5, you've got to deal with f4 issues as well. So this brings the bishop back. Boris Gelfand hopes to give back the exchange to diminish our attack. But queen h5. One threat here is to take on h2 and queen f3 check, forking king and bishop, as well, of course, with this rook simply hanging on b1. Another threat is to simply play bishop h3 and sit on the light squares. It's very difficult for white to just control against the queen entering on f3 with mate shortly. So h4 tried to prevent both those ideas, but bishop d3 would be much stronger than taking the rook. White is simply paralyzed here. We can play calmly with e4, bishop e5, queen g4, win the pawn on g3. White can't move the queen from g2 because there'll be mate with queen h3 mate, and actually he just can't really move anything. There we see one of the strongest players in the world run into deep, deep trouble facing my pet line. White can also play it a little bit differently with rook e1. Now, white here is trying to keep the center flexible. We can still continue with queen e7, but the problem is that after bishop f1, white is defending his center much more easily than in the previous line. The bishop on c1 isn't getting in the way of the rook defending the e4 pawn, and so it's difficult for us to force a concession out of white. And he's able to play a bit more flexibly. So we'll do it with the rook instead. Now the bishop drops back to f1, and now a subtle half-waiting move with a6. We're getting ready to take on d4 and play c6 when we're ready to expand with b5 in all probability. Although if white plays a plan with f3, trying to erect some sort of Maroczy bind, then you should be ready to play the d5 break as well, leaving white with some weak dark squares at the end. If white pushes the pawn, then the structure changes. First of all, we'll check rook b1, which was played against me in a very recent game. The most recent time I essayed the King's Indian. International master in the French top 12 French team championships played this against me. Obviously, he was very well prepared, as we're following an earlier game of mine against Radek Wojtaszek, a strong Polish grandmaster. So this time we have a different structure, but we still have ambitions. We've got ideas of breaking with b5, as well as playing on the king side, as you'll see in the game. Now knight h5 is a bit of an annoying threat when the bishop runs out of good squares. If it goes back to e3, then knight g4. So white plays h3 to give the bishop a square, knight h5. White should consider going back to e3 here as well. But then b5 works for us. It's a murky position, but the tactics work out fine. Instead, bishop h2 is more natural. And here, queen f6 was my improvement over my previous game with Radek. It's all about taking control of the f4 square. White was threatening to play f4, forcing our knight back from e5, and we really don't want that. So here we're ready to hop in with knight f4. My opponent had a long think here, and obviously really didn't like his position. The problem is that as well as taking control of the f4 square, we're also threatening simply to win a pawn with knight takes c4 and queen takes d4. And so my opponent went for an extremely passive way to defend against that with knight de2. Now this does fulfill the job of controlling the f4 square and not allow annoying knight sacks. If knight takes c4, then white will at least gain some time with b3. Then knight goes back, f4, knight has to go back again, and then g4 traps a knight on h5. So this was his interesting idea. You can see the problems after queen d2, that we can simply take this pawn and take on d4. In the course, I say that the best move is queen c1, getting out of the way, preparing to put rook on the d file, and more importantly, controlling the f4 square. But then I recommend g5, just taking f4 square under control. White then needs to rush, because otherwise we have time for queen g6 and g4 with a big attack against white's king. But knight d2 had some logic. Here, I was tossing up between g5 and bishop h6. I decided on bishop h6. It's unclear which is better, but I think this is the nicer practical move. We take control of the f4 square. And actually, white needs to be incredibly careful here. There are a lot of tactics. The move my opponent chose was knight g3, but after knight f4, if he spoke to his pieces, they're not at all happy. This bishop on h2 does not have much future. The knight on g3 can only go back again to e2, except it can't because knight d3 will win material. And so he could barely move, and I could switch back to playing on the queen side. I broke with b5 and was soon with a decisive advantage. Objectively, his best is simply to retreat with knight d4, but then we're very, very comfortable with b5. The most logical move, now that we are threatening to take the pawn on c4 with no f4 at the end, is to defend the pawn with b3. And this is what I was expecting, but we can actually win here with bishop takes h3, a resource that you should be looking out for with this structure. If white simply takes it, knight f3 check, king h1, it might not look like the end of the world for white. If we have to take on e1, queen takes, and material is roughly level with bishop and knight for rook and pawn, and our attack is probably not decisive. Take on h2 and take on f2 is also interesting, with 2 pawns for the attack. I couldn't quite find a kill there. Then I noticed a final pretty move, bishop d2. Instead of taking the rook immediately, we simply attack it. And now instead of winning the exchange, we win the whole rook. It can't move, can't bring another defender to it. And if you move the knight away from e2, we'll take the rook and then take the knight on c3. So bishop takes e5 is a better try in general, but this fails too. There's no longer a knight f3 check. And rook takes, bring the rook in via rook g5 check is the most natural, but the surprising de is just winning here. After white takes the bishop, rook d8, and it transpires white has to just give back the piece with knight d5 when he's just going to mated on the king side anyway. It's got a horrible structure. The problem is that the only square for the queen c2, runs into rook d2. Now the only square again is queen c1, and you take on e2, just go to attack on the queen. And if you take on h6, then it's mate. Queen takes f2 and knight g3 mate. You see there are a lot of tactics for white to navigate. The other structure is to play d5. But now we waste a move, but we're very happy that white's committed to d5 with a5. In the full course, you'll see this position if white had played the immediate d5, with bishop back on e2, rook back on f1, and our rook back on f8. In some ways, we've lost 2 tempi over that position because we played a6, a5 in 2 goes, and the rook is probably better on f8 because we're getting ready to play the f5 break. But even this position is extremely comfortable for black, so you can imagine how good the immediate d5 is for us. Now, I had a game where my opponent played knight a4 to stop my knight jumping into c5 immediately. After b6 and knight c5, if in doubt, you always want to be able to recapture towards the center here. This d6 pawn is important, keeping our structure together, and we've got long-term counterplay on the b file here as well. In the game, my opponent went after the a5 pawn with a4, bishop c3, knight d2, knight b3, but it was very, very slow. And in the meantime, I got a really dangerous attack on the king side, and I crashed through. You can see the model game there if you pop over to the full lifetime repertoire course. Instead, rook b1 is the more natural move. The problem for white is that he wants to play a3, b4 and take control of the c5 square, attack with c5. The issue is that he can't play it immediately because his rook is hanging on a1. So he needs to waste a tempo to get that rook safe, so probably rook b1. You could also move the bishop to do it. The second problem is that, for example, after rook b1, knight c5, white needs to waste another tempo, because if he starts with a3, then a4 prevents b4, gives us a nice outpost on b3, and also means that knight just can't be shifted from c5 anymore. b4 could be prepared with knight d2, but it's just going to wreck white's structure after we take en passant. So white has to play it slowly with b3. And now bishop d7 is a useful thing to remember, the idea of meeting a3 with a4. Once again, white has this choice to make. If he takes on a4, then we have an outpost on c5 for life, and white's structure is bad. So it goes b4, now we can hop in with knight b3. Losing the dark square bishop is almost always very bad for white in these King's Indians. Without it, he struggles to get any counterplay on the queen side, and our attack on the king side is much stronger. But the problem is here, the bishop doesn't have a good square. If bishop e3, we can continue chasing it with knight g4, and we accelerate our attack over on the king side with the typical f5 break. Bishop b2 would be possible, but the bishop's just completely misplaced there. Gets in the way of his own attack over on the queen side, and we can just get on with it over on the king side with knight h5 and f5. Knight takes a4 was played in the game that inspired me to take up this line. It's an interesting exchange sacrifice. We take on a4, rook takes b3, white's hoping that he'll be able to utilize his extra pawn over on the queen side and push with c5. But we keep the initiative by taking on c1. The only move not to lose material is knight c3. And now a strong deflection with knight a2. The knight is lost on c1, but we'll make sure that white loses some time. So knight takes a2, rook takes a3, attacking the knight, which was defended. But now a very strong, unusual exchange sacrifice with the rook takes f3. Not a move you often see in the King's Indian, especially when the f-file is still not yet open. Coming round the side is an unusual motif. After g takes knight h5, this was l'Arbre Fraissinet, the Frenchman was already winning. There's simply no defense to putting the bishop in on f4 and queen in on h4 with mate on h2. The queen, bishops, and knight work so wonderfully together, and f4 is a horrible outpost for white to defend against. So you can see that there are a lot of problems for white in this line. He could try and exploit our move order with bishop e3, e5, and now d5, castle would transpose back. Here it's important to be accurate. Don't play the automatic knight c5, because after knight d2, white's managed to get his perfect setup. He likes having his bishops on e3 and e2, and knights d2 and c3. If you think back to the line we just covered, white's going to be much faster now with a3 and b4, because the rook is defended, so he doesn't have to lose a tempo with that. Another point is that after a5 to stop b4, white can close up the king side with g4. This is a setup we really want to avoid. If we can't get in the f5 break, which is going to be difficult here, because white hasn't castled kingside yet and will go rook g1 himself, then we're really passive. We're struggling to find any counterplay here. So let's think and be accurate here and look at the downside of playing the bishop out so early, and that's to chase it with knight g4. Now white can go two ways with the bishop. The bishop can go forward to g5 or back to d2. In fact, they're likely to transpose. If white goes to d2 immediately, after f5, we'll get the same position, just a tempo less for each side. Example, after g5, f6, white normally drops back to d2. Going to h4 is an option as well. But now we continue with our normal kingside attack with f5. White's got to be careful. We've already got some dangerous pressure on f2 with the rook and knight getting involved. For example, if white tries h3 to expel our knight, critical is knight g5 to try and exploit our early f5 by jumping in with knight e6. After knight c5, the position is sharp, but we're doing fine. But h3 is a big mistake. We can crash through with knight takes f2, king takes, and take on e4. Now, due to the pin, white has to take back, or else we'll just be a pawn up with the attack. But now we can use that pin again with queen h4 check. White should drop back, but e4 once again regains the piece with a very good position. Instead, king e3, trying to hold on to the knight this way. Our queen is attacked, but now we have a very pretty finish. Bishop h6 check, king d3. It looks like white is surviving. He's got an extra piece. The king is about to run over to the queen side, but we have a win. Can you spot it? Queen takes e4 check. Now if the king runs to c3, then he's just lost anyway. Pawn down, the king's in the middle of the board. We've got a big attack, but taking our queen, then it's a beautiful mate in the middle of the board with knight c5. So that is my alternative line with knight bd7, which can also be played via move order e5, castle, and then knight bd7. But I also cover all the main lines here with e5, when white has a choice. We have the classical main line with castle kingside, we have the Gligorich with bishop e3, and we have the Petrosian with d5. I also cover d takes e5 and the exchange variation, and prove it's not so easy for white to find equality there even. We have the better structure because we've got an outpost on d4. White doesn't have a corresponding outpost on d5 because we can always play c6. And so long term, we've got the better structure. And therefore, white actually needs to play quite dynamically, or he can just shift into a really unpleasant position. We'll start by looking at the classical variation. Knight c6. Now there's a lot more pressure on this pawn on d4 than in the knight bd7 line. And in fact, we're threatening to take on d4 immediately and then take on e4. This tactic is worth remembering if white now plays the waiting move. But white tends to push on, knight e7, and this is the Mar del Plata variation, the most theoretical main line of the King's Indian. Now white's main move in number of games is knight e1. This reaches the wonderfully sharp, double-edged fights that are so typical of the King's Indian. White's going to attack on the queen side, try to break through with c5, and either enter on the c file or crash through with pushing his pawns with a4, a5, a6. But we are very, very fast on the king side. Our attack is coming. And in fact, people have really stopped playing this way as white at that elite level. Theoretically, black is doing well, and practically it's just so scary for white. Your king is getting mated, one misstep, and that's game over. We shift our knight out of the way. We're ready for f5. And here, once again, white has a choice. Bishop e3 is the main move by number of games, and most principled, but incredibly risky. On the one hand, the bishop is very good on this diagonal. It attacks our pawn on a7, but more importantly, it prepares c5. Of course, not quite yet, but white's getting ready to break with c5. He's going to play f3 as well and hope that his bishop back on f2 or on g1, after he sidesteps with king h1, keeps his king safe. But the big downside is he loses the tempo, and every tempo matters here. After f5, f3, f4, we kickstart our pawn storm. He has to go back and g5. And our plan here is really very straightforward. We're going to go knight f6, knight g6, get the g4 break in, maybe prepared by h5, depending what white does. Then we're likely to sacrifice the pawn again with g3. White is obliged to take it most of the time, but in return, we'll have a strong outpost on f4, and knight will hop again to h5, the queen will enter on g5, and we'll have a big attack already. The bishop on g7 might also enter the game with bishop h6. And white's king is extremely, extremely precariously placed. This is our plan, which looks straightforward. And of course, there are some nuances, but overall, I think it's much easier to play as black. We'll have a look at an example here. Example a4. Rook c1 is probably the most topical way of playing the position, and Wesley So's choice in a few games. White understands that it's a huge race, and he's ready to play c5 as a pawn sacrifice to try and put some pressure against our pawn on c7. We'll check this out too in the main course, as well as white's other tries here. Instead here, we'll have a look at a4. Now, this one I suggest blocking with a5. I won a nice game once in the British Championships with rook f6, with a caveman approach of going rook h6, queen e8, queen h5, and mating on h2. But it's quite risky giving white a complete free hand on the queen side, and I'm not sure it's entirely sound in this position. So let's just play a5, stop that pawn going any further. In the main course, I discuss when we should deal with a4 with a5 and when to ignore it. It really boils down to whether white can get in c4, c5 easily. Here, he's not threatening it yet because we're defending the square twice, and we're ready to close up after knight d3, b6. So white's not getting in his c4, c5 break. Instead, he has to switch to b4. Knight b5 is also played, but it'll simply transpose after knight c5. So b4, we exchange. And now white has an interesting move with knight b5. This looks strange, but the point is that white is trying to get in a4, a5. Basically, his whole strategy here is to get in c4, c5 break, which is rather difficult to do here with our pawns on d6 and b6. And so first he wants to get rid of our pawn on b6. So he needs to get in a4, a5 to exchange those, and then he can play c4, c5. So that means that the quickest way of getting in a4, a5 is to support it. So he goes knight b5. The idea is to go bishop e1 to take on b4. Then he can get in a5. This structure we'll also see in the bayonet attack, and rather a better version for white, but still not one to worry about. But here this plan is way too slow. We can jump in with knight c5, and after bishop e1, just trying to get this plan to work. If white does take on b4, he just struggles to find a good continuation of how to break through, and we can already play g4. It's worth always checking whether we can go g4 without preparation. Often when this knight has moved away from c3, we can play g4 immediately because the e4 pawn would be hanging if he recaptures, and so we don't need to prepare it with h5. So bishop e1 and g4 again. You see that white can't take this because the e4 pawn hangs, but after bishop takes b4, g3, we're much too fast. A thematic response is h3, and important to look at. Now, as in the course, I emphasize and reiterate over and over how important our bishop is on c8. Don't allow white to exchange it. A lot of the white variations, the sole strategy is to try and get rid of this bishop. And that's because of this structure. If that bishop had been exchanged, we would really struggle to break into white's position. There's no pawn breaks, and our knights aren't really well placed to stack either, yet, although knight g6 to h4, take on g2 is a plan. However, here we can crash through immediately with bishop takes h3, a really important theme in these Mar del Plata King's Indians. You shouldn't tarry. If knight g6, rook e1, white's going to be in time to play bishop f1, holding onto this pawn on h3. So once again, tempi at everything. Bishop takes h3, queen d7. Now white can't allow queen takes h3 check, moves his king forward, but now the knight joins in the attack. Knight gets to h4 check, king f1 allows g2, so he has to go to g1, and now we can crash through. The knight takes e4, offering another piece, but if it's taken, f3, and these two pawns are just going to win the game for us. Win the piece back immediately, but we don't want to take on e2. We'll go f2 check. If king f1, g2 is mate. So this is quite a thematic line in the Mar del Plata, and shows the power of this bishop on c8. We don't worry about moving it, we'll leave it on c8, but we're ready to sack on h3. So that is the main line of the entire King's Indian with knight e1. You reach these glorious double-edged positions where we're just going for white's king, and white has to be super accurate to stop just being mated in the opening. Now, the dreaded line for a lot of players, without really knowing the theory, but just thinking about abstractly the King's Indian, go, oh yeah, the King's Indian, tricky, but refuted by the bayonet attack. Now, b4 is a bayonet, and I'll show that it's far from refuting the line. That's a choice here. Knight h5 is the main line, but I don't really like it. Black has to play very accurately for a long sequence of moves to absorb some pressure, and then he should equalize, but we don't really get the winning chances that I want. Instead, I prefer a5. I think this is the most principled move. We exploit that white's played b4 a bit early. He's not in time to play a3 because we can simply take, because again, this rook hangs on a1. And so white has to allow a concession, damage his structure, and delay his c4, c5. He can do it a couple of different ways. b5 would be a terrible move. After b6, White's shown a rather lack of understanding in these structures. It's White who's attacking on the queen side, and with the queen side completely blocked up like this, he can't break through and gives us a free hand to attack over on the king side. We also have a very nice outpost on c5 for our knight to hop into. So White plays either taking this pawn or bishop a3. Bishop a3 is a bit more common, in fact, but the two lines are very likely to transpose. After b takes a5, I just want to take. I think there's a useful rule of thumb here that I don't want to play c7 to c5 until White has moved this knight from f3. The reasoning is that if we play c5, for example, as was played in a recent top-level game, Anish Giri against Alexander Grishuk, after Anish's clever moves of sort of waiting for a bit and playing generally useful moves, it's very difficult for us to find counterplay. We always want to play for the f7, f5 break in the King's Indian. But the issue here is when we do, White will go knight g5 and hop into e6. We'll have to take that, and when d takes e6 happens, White will have a big outpost on d5 and pressure down the d file against this pawn on d6. I really don't want to allow this structure with a pawn on c5. I think it's far better if our pawn is back on c7, because then we can play c6, holding onto the d5 square and not giving away this outpost. Then this strategy of knight g5 to e6 is very risky for White, because we might simply win the pawn on e6 and be a pawn up. So, if White's knight is still on f3, or close to f3, I don't want to play c5. Now, White's plan is to play c4, c5 himself and crash through in typical King's Indian classical style. And so we'll probably play b6 to stop it if that knight is still hanging around our king side and the g5 square. So we take the pawn. Now there's lots of different move orders here that I'll go into depth in the main course over in the lifetime repertoire. But here we'll just have a look at one idea with a4. Now there's lots of possible knight jumps here, but I think e8 is the most sensible one. This was played by Alexander Grishuk a couple of months ago. I've tried knight h5, which is also okay. The idea is to hop into f4 and win one of the bishops, but White can deal with that threat. And then the issue is that f5 is a bit harder to arrange, because after e takes f5, gf, we've got to watch out for the knight moving from f3 with a discovered attack on the knight on h5. Even knight takes e5 in some positions, although at the moment the knight is hanging on c3. So I think it's more circumspect to come back to e8. In the knight e1 lines, I prefer going to d7. But again, we have a slight difference because this knight remains on f3, that I don't want to block the bishop on c8. If we go knight d7 after f5, we've got to be really careful about knight g5, threatening to jump into e6. And so I prefer to keep the bishop active on c8 with the potential of just taking the knight on e6 while his knight remains on f3. Now the main line is bishop a3. White's threat is bishop b4, hitting the rook, and c5. So we should stop that break with b6. c5 was Grishuk's choice again in this game against Alireza Firouzja. But as I just mentioned, I don't like playing c5 while White's knight is still on f3. It's probably playable, but I find it a bit passive because it's just hard to get in the f5 break because knight g5 is such a big problem. So we'll do it the other way, b6, bishop b4, and rook back to a8. And this position has been played by both Timur Radjabov, the King's Indian specialist, and even the world champion himself, Magnus Carlsen, has defended this position. Now, the key point is that it's not so easy for White to actually get any further over on the queen side. We're ready to play f5 ourselves, and a5, the most natural move, and the whole point of this bishop round, a whole point in quite a few lines, as we saw already in our classical line. But here, a5 fails tactically. We can exploit our knight being on e8 to play c5, an idea you should remember in these bayonet attacks. The bishop can't retreat because we simply take the pawn on a5, and after dc, knight takes. Our knight does a good job of defending the pawn on d6, and so we're actually just winning material here. We attack the bishop, and if it drops back, we can take the pawn on a5. example, bishop a3, knight takes a5. White can try and be tricky with queen d5, pinning the knight, but we defend it. We renew the attack on the a6 pawn, on the a5 pawn, and so white tries a6, after knight takes b4, and rook b8. This queen is actually trapped. If queen a7, knight c6, so white has to play a7, give up his queen, but he just ends the pawn down after we simply take the queen. So that is a bayonet attack. White has to be very careful about our c5 break, and we should just be flexible whether we play c5 or b6 as a way to stop c4, c5. They're very strategically interesting positions, but far from a refutation of the King's Indian. I'll look at one final move here. Knight d2 is the other main line, but it's not played very much these days. a5 does quite a good job of slowing up white's play. The problem with knight d2 is it's on a great circuit if white can achieve c4, c5 and knight c4, but if he can't, then the knight is just misplaced on d2, blocking in the bishop on c1. Bishop g5 is quite a topical sideline, the so-called Odessa variation. It's quite a controversial move. For once, white's willing to give up his bishop and take on f6. His argument is that it's going to be then easier to get in his b4, c5 break because we've got a lot less pressure on e4 after the exchange. This knight on f6 is our good knight. The knight on e7, on the other hand, doesn't do a lot, and so I would quite like to simply move this knight. Knight h5 is more common, but like in the bayonet that I just mentioned, it makes it harder for us to achieve f5 because we always have to watch out after ef, gf. We always want to recapture with the pawn if we have the choice. That our knight on h5 is suddenly hanging. So let's just go back with it. Now white doesn't want to give up his bishop for the other knight because this knight isn't doing anything on e7. I'm ready to play f5 and knight f6, putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on e4 anyway. So white normally plays knight d2 to give a bit of support to this pawn. f5, f3, and here I like to get on with it immediately with f4. Now, white has to be a bit careful here already. If he plays an automatic b4, then after bishop f6, we're getting these bishops off the board. Bishop h6 isn't possible. We just move the rook, and the bishop is trapped. It's not a good defense to king h8, knight g8. But we're very happy with the bishop exchange. That's white's very good bishop and our bad bishop. And if you look, suddenly this long diagonal looks a bit airy for white without that bishop sitting on f2. He's left with a very bad bishop on e2, and our play on the king side is extremely fast here. We're simply going g5, h5, knight g6, g4, maybe rook f7 to g7. Another advantage, that bishop doesn't have to get out of the way, and it's going to be mate on the g file. White's not going to be able to cope. So he has to show good understanding here and get this bishop back again to f2, a rather odd circuit for it. Here I like king h8, a rather subtle move. The point will be revealed in a moment. After b4, g5, pawn sacrifice. Now, if white declines it, we're just quite a few tempi up on the classical lines. That bishop has gone a long way round. g5 to h4 to f2, losing a tempo in the process, and we've not lost any tempi. All of our moves have been the normal ones. So our kingside attack is very fast. And if he takes on g5, we'll offer this bishop exchange anyway. Once again, he's forced to exchange bishops. If bishop h6, we have rook g8 now, and rook g6. The bishop's trapped. So he takes, but now we can recapture. Our threat is the simple rook h6, knight g6, queen h4, with mate on h2. We can also attack down the g file. White is a pawn up, but is never going to be able to exploit it. Our attack is much too powerful. There's no way that white's ever going to exchange pieces and win this endgame a pawn up. We are not going to acquiesce to the exchanges, and white's king is in a whole lot of trouble. Before the endgame, the gods have placed the middle game. So that is the classical variation with castle. I can also play the Gligorich variation with bishop e3. Now, once again, we've got to be careful here. Playing the automatic knight c6, as you do in the classical, allows white his ideal formation with d5 and knight d2. And remember, white will play g4 next, and it's going to be very difficult for us to generate any counterplay. f5 is probably just going to weaken our king, as white can still go long with his. One of the points of bishop e3 is he's staying flexible with his king. Now, if you want, you can transpose back into the classical knight bd7 lines, my pet variation, with knight bd7. While if you were just trying to equalize by force, I have a sneaky feeling ED might be best, but this is very similar to ED in the classical. And it's one of those lines I feel that white has some nibble, and if black is very accurate, he can absorb the pressure and equalize, but not my intention in this course. We're trying for winning chances everywhere. And so I think, once again, knight g4 is the most principled. The bishop should move again. We always gain a lot if we can get rid of his bishop. So he goes bishop g5. We play f6. And there's a choice with where to go with this bishop. Bishop c1 looks odd. White has wasted 2 moves, or even 3 moves with this bishop, e3 to g5 and back to c1, to force us to play knight g4 and f6. Now, f6 is more of a concession when the center is still fluid. If he'd gone d5, we're very happy to play f5. But here, if white has chances of playing d5, then we should delay our kingside attack for a little. First of all, we want the center closed, then we'll attack over on the kingside. So knight c6, again, putting pressure on the pawn on d4, d5, and here we have a strong pawn sacrifice that has diffused the idea of bishop c1. I should mention in passing that Sam Shankland in his course here recommends castle kingside, but I don't think much of it. I think after f5, black is already more comfortable. But here we hop in, and here white actually shouldn't play the automatic queen takes d4. Knight b5 is a better try, although I'll show after f5 we still have very good play for the pawn, and I think it's a position that's easier for black. The problem with the automatic queen takes d4 is f5. Now queen went back to d1 in the stem game that was played by the very strong Dutch grandmaster Erwin Lamy, who's also a theoretician, but he doesn't survive the opening here. It was better to go to d2, but it's still very miserable. We can sacrifice this knight with f takes e4, opening up our rook. Now, knight takes e4, queen e7 is also very unpleasant for white. Take on g4 runs into queen takes e2, and otherwise it's just very difficult for white to actually hold on to his position here. It's too much pressure down the e and f files. So bishop takes g4, but now we have queen h4 with a double attack, both on the bishop and threatening mate on f2. The only way to deal with both is bishop e2, but now a very strong move by Nisipianu. Bishop takes c3 check, nice timing, and then queen takes f2, and bishop g4. And white has big problems with this pin down over to his king on the second rank. The most immediate threat is e3 check. When king d3, bishop f5 check, king d4, queen f4 is mate. The king can't run because the bishop hangs on e2. If white tries to defend it with rook e1, then simply queen takes g2, gobbling a pawn, but bringing the rook into the game as well. Rook f2 is coming. And now if rook g1, then e3 check. It's winning at least this bishop on e2. Owen tried a creative defense with c5. The point is that after e3 check now, the king can run to d3 and then c4 and b3 and escape. But Nisipianu highlights the downside with rook f5, attacking this pawn on d5. And it's just not a good defense here. For example, c4 to defend it runs into the bishop exchange and queen d4 check, collecting this rook on a1 when we're a lot of material up. So bishop h4 is a more common move now that knight d4 was discovered, and this pawn sacrifice was extremely strong. We once again go knight c6, putting pressure on this pawn. White normally pushes, knight e7. Now, I don't think much generally of castling in these positions. I think the position is much easier for us to play. In this style of position, we're going to go knight g6 and f5, and we can push on the king side easily enough. Not so clear what white is doing, and this bishop is often just misplaced on g3. I've got to watch out for h5, h4, even just trapping the bishop. So knight d2 is a better try. And here I like f5, most forcing option. We get an odd structure when white takes. That's the most forcing move. If he doesn't, we're ready to play bishop f6 next. Exchange off these bishops, and once again we get a good version of the classical lines. So take. Now we've got a weird doubled g-pawns, but we do have a nice outpost on f4 that we get to use. white actually has to be extremely accurate here. If he plays an automatic castle, it's much better to play bishop g5, when we'll play h6, bishop goes back to e3, and g5, followed by hopping in with knight g6 to f4. But if castle bishop h6 is a big problem, suddenly this bishop on h4 is running out of squares. And our very simple plan is to play g5, force bishop back, and knight g6. For example, b4, g5, knight g6. And now our bishop's job on h6 is done. We come back. And white is going to have to make some big concession, big weakness with f3, where suddenly it's white with a weak structure when we take, rather than us, to prevent h5, h4, just trapping this bishop. Finally, we'll look at d5, the Petrosian variation. Now, in some ways, this is illogical. If you compare it to the main line, the classical, where white castles knight c6, he gains a tempo with d5, and our knight is forced to e7. Here, playing it immediately gives us access to the c5 square. As we've already seen in the knight bd7 lines, for instance, this knight is ready to take c5, or sometimes even support the other knight hopping around to c5, depending exactly on white's setup. Of course, matters aren't so clear. White is unlikely to castle kingside. We're very happy to see it. Instead, he's going to try and slow up our play with f7, f5. And he's got a couple ways of doing that. There's the typical Petrosian way of playing bishop g5. Now, this pin is just slightly annoying. For example, h6, white keeps the pin. He can go back as well. Bishop e3 was Kramnik's choice against Hikaru Nakamura in an interesting game from a few years ago. It worked really well as a surprise weapon, but objectively, I think the position is easier for black. Once again, we'll go for it with knight g4 and f5. Bishop h4 is the main line with a Petrosian. We develop, and white drops back to d2. A multi-purpose move. Make sure that we don't have g5, h5, or g5, knight h5 to trap this bishop on h4. And it's ready to play f3 to get this bishop back involved in the game and gives more support to the pawn on e4. Sometimes he's even going to go g4, but here it's unlikely. And the main line is to play queen e8 and reach a tab here, where white will be playing f3, castle, bring the bishop back to f2, and play for a3, b4. Probably starts with b3. I think that position is okay for black, but it's what white is playing the Petrosian for. We need to be accurate to make sure we don't get steamrolled and just Python strategy squeezed to death. So instead, I'm going to keep ourselves in the pin because we've got a sneaky idea in mind. Now, white's got lots of move orders that I cover in the main course, but his main line is to castle and now play b3. He doesn't see any danger. He wants to play a3 and b4. Once again, a3 first runs into a4, and if white can't play b4 without the en passant, then he's just in trouble because we've got a nice outpost on c5, and b4 is just going to weaken his position. So b3, a3, b4 is the idea, but we can exploit that his knight is suddenly not defended with a very interesting queen sacrifice with knight takes e4, bishop takes d8, and take on c3. Now, after queen e1, we take the bishop. The stem game, or at least one of the early games, was Kasparov playing this in a blitz game, and he took with f rook. It's much more natural to take rook a takes d8. I think people stopped looking at the line after Kasparov's rook f d8, where white is better, but after rook a takes, we have fantastic compensation. So, first of all, let's count the material. White is a queen up for bishop and knight and pawn. So if you count with the traditional point scoring system, that's 9 versus 7. So we're about the same material down as an exchange sacrifice. In return, we've got a very flexible structure. We have no weaknesses. This bishop is super strong on g7. We're about to play e4 when it dominates. We have much more active pieces, a very strong knight on c5. And we've got quite an easy plan of playing rook t e8 and either knight hop into d3 when this queen is short on squares, or just pushing with f5, f4. I think this position is already very difficult for white practically, and even from a theoretical point of view, it's white trying to make a draw here. Rook c1 was played in a recent game by Russian grandmaster against Alexander Grishuk, who tried out this line. Either Fallujah has also played it as black recently, so I imagine they'll start to become more and more popular. But at the moment, it will still surprise your opponents. Rook c1, the idea, it's a natural move. The idea is if we take on a2, he'll go rook a1 and have an open file for his rook. At the moment, you notice the rooks are pretty useless because there's no open files. We have all 8 pawns that he can't get past. In fact, White's best move is to kick our knight immediately with knight b1. But such a unnatural developing move isn't natural. It also allows us to win the exchange back with taking on e2 and e4. But we're probably not going to rush taking that rook. Rook c1 is more natural, but now e4 to defend that knight. Now rook c2 runs into bishop f5 when e3 is a very annoying threat, as well as the knight hopping into d3. But a3 also runs into trouble. Here, rook fe8 would have been very strong. The threat is knight d3, trapping the queen. After bishop takes e takes, the queen has nowhere to run. And if knight b1 to try and give the queen a square, we still go in. The exchange, queen d2. With the fork, we regain our lost material. And material is level, but we're just winning here, actually. We're just going to bring our rooks in. Rook e2, rook e8. Our rook pair and the bishops just dominate. White's piece is so passive, and he's got some back rank issues as well. And so it's just lost here. The other way to try and play against that f5 break is a weird kind of overlap between the Petrosian variation and the Mechanigoff, or the h3 system. White could have played this by starting with h3 rather than bishop e2, and the lines often transpose. White can also try to play without bishop e2, and we'll check that out briefly after this via the h3 move order. It tends to be more popular if White wants this position to start by playing h3, but we should be aware of the possible transpositions. Luckily, I'm advising to play the same setup against both, so we're not going to get move ordered. We play our knight a6. Now g4 would be the Mechanigoff style of playing the position, in which case I would recommend playing the knight around from f6 to c5 to prepare f5. Instead, bishop g5 is the Petrosian way. Now we get out of the pin. Here, h6 probably isn't so good because White can go bishop e3. We can't go knight g4 because the pawn is on h3. And this was White's idea behind starting with h3. But queen e8, we get ready to move our knight either to d7 or into h5 and f4 if White allows it. But White normally stops that knight to h5 with either knight back to d2 or g4 here. For example, knight d2, knight d7. This is a pure Petrosian way of playing the position. a3. Now, the point of a3 is important in all of these Petrosian and h3 systems. Our knight is destined for the c5 square. Our next couple of moves are going to be knight c5 and f5. With a3, White sets a trap. If we go knight to c5 now, then b4 is really annoying. We saw before that it was difficult for White to get in the b4 break because his rook was hanging on a1. And here, roles are reversed. We can't take twice because our rook is hanging on a8. And so with a3, White is trying to slow us down. Now you can go knight b6. This is a main line and suggestion in similar positions in the course, with the idea of playing bishop d7 and knight a4, either exchanging off one of these superfluous knights. We've got 2 knights and they're both on the d5 square, while White's knight is strong, controlling the e4 square, or provoking a weakness with b3 when f5 will come with much more power, because White will have problems on long diagonal, particularly with a loose knight on c3. So knight b6 is fine, but I actually had this position in a game from a couple of years ago, and I was analyzing with the new Leela 0 engine, and I noticed it recommended after f6, bishop h4, to play f5, which was very surprising, but I played it in the game. My opponent, unfortunately, didn't play ef and played f3, and we had some interesting battle that ended in a draw. Then I looked further and noticed actually we should play f5 immediately. Now this was given question mark in the old theory, and your opponent might be really excited when we go f5. The point is that after e takes, now White really does need to take the pawn. If f3, bishop f6 is awkward. when the bishop was on h4, bishop f2 would be a good defense. But here, bishop e3 runs into bishop h4 check. And so white has to allow the exchange of bishops when he's just left with some big holes on the dark squares. So take. Now, don't recapture, please. I recaptured in a similar position once and allowed this bishop h5 when our queen is trapped. Mine was even more embarrassing because I didn't have a rook on f8, and so I had to give up my entire queen. Here, at least, you could limp on with rook f7. But our idea is not to recapture. Knight f6 is very interesting, but I think the most precise is just to get on with it with e4. Now we do threaten to take this pawn on f5, because bishop h5 is no longer trapping our queen. We've got the e5 square. The most graceful must be to take, but it's also very greedy. I think the best move is probably to play f6 and give the pawn back, but we're doing well there as well. Here, we gain a tempo on this knight, and now f4 is a strong move, trapping the bishop on g5, and guaranteeing a nice outpost on e5 for our knight. After castle kingside, white has to do something with the threat of queen g6 and taking on g2 now. We should take on c3. Now, this move is always controversial, but works very well here. As well as white's wreck structure, we've got this fantastic outpost on c5 for the a6 knight. We first of all jump the other knight into an outpost. Having two outposts with two knights is very good. Now we're threatening queen g6 and bishop takes h3 ideas. This bishop on g5 is very short on squares. So white plays king h2 to circumvent this bishop takes h3 problem. Queen g6, bishop e7, rook f5. We're following a recent correspondence game. But white is in a lot of trouble here. Our threat is simply to play queen h6 and king f7 when that bishop is trapped on e7. We've got long-term better structure, fantastic squares for our knight, and a kingside attack. I think we're just doing very well. So that is the Petrosian variation. We'll also have a quick look at the Mechanigoff with the immediate h3. Now, as I mentioned, this has a lot of chances to transpose to the Petrosian after a5. Knight h5 is a sharp alternative, but let's be consistent and go for the same structure. So if white ever goes bishop e2, we transpose to the Petrosian variation. White can try and play without it. For example, with bishop e3, knight a6. And here, g4 is probably the most principled move. When we'll go knight d7, knight dc5, and f5 if we can, but we need to watch out for a3 and b4 idea, of course. Instead, it's quite common for white to play knight d2, trying to shuffle these pieces around. When knight d7 anyway, we're getting ready to play f5. So white tries to slow it up with g4. Playing knight b3, b6 doesn't change very much. All white has done really is lose control of the e4 square, and we're still ready to hop the knight into c5. We don't mind one knight being exchanged. So g4 is the idea, to try and slow up f5, but we can play it anyway. Knight dc5 is a good alternative. Here, white obviously has to deal with the threat of f4, so he tends to take twice. And we don't want to take with the rook. Instead, we'd much prefer to take with the bishop, when our bishop pair are going to be very strong. White really doesn't want to allow to play e4, because then this bishop dominates the entire board. And so knight to e4 to try and maintain the square, but we'll take on f5. Now our plan is to get rid of this knight from e4 and play e4. White's most critical is to try and hold on to it, so bishop g2. And now there's lots of good moves, but I like the chaos with queen h4. Attacking the knight again. Now white really doesn't want to move the knight. If he drops it back, then knight d3 checks are coming. Taking twice on c5 is not helping. f2 is going to be very weak, and we're simply playing e4, e3. Bishop on g7 joins, rook on a8 can come to the e-file with a huge attack. But, you say, with your sharp tactical eye, hasn't queen h4 just blundered a queen? Bishop g5. Well, it's true that we would be in a lot of trouble here if it were not for one move, knight d3 check, a very strong idea. If white takes this, we can take the bishop on g5 now, because after he takes our queen, the queen is dropping on d3. White has tried a few different king moves, but king e2 was Ding Liren's choice when he had the position, and so should be taken very seriously. Queen h5 check. Now, if king takes d3, we use the same pin with queen takes g5. So we're not getting a piece here. But bishop f3. Now we start getting some material. Another queen sacrifice. Queen takes f3, check. King takes. Bishop takes e4, check. Now white can't take this because the knight takes f2, check. And we win the queen and end a pawn up with a very good position. So king e3. And here, Ding Loren's opponent chose knight takes f2. And he made a draw against his illustrious opponent quite comfortably. But I think it's even stronger just to drop back with bishop g6. So we only have 2 pieces for the queen, but white's king is obviously not ideally placed on e3. We've got ideas of taking on f2 still, pushing e4, and bishop on g5 is very short on squares. And I think our counterplay is very powerful here. For example, f3 would stop knight takes f2, but runs into e4. The bishops join the fray. If he plays fe4, knight f2, there's also knight takes b2 on the cards now as well, with the knight hanging on c3. So matters are difficult for white. So h4 is probably best going for counterplay, try and knock our bishop away. But we can take on f2 anyway. After queen g1, we take the rook. Material is level. Our threat is to play h6. At the moment, winning the bishop. But if the bishop is forced back to h4, then he loses control of the important f4 square. If our rook can get to f4, take a pawn on c4, also come in to d4 and d3 check, is rather awkward. And simply doubling the rooks. And we've got a very powerful attack. And white doesn't even have extra materials to show for it. So that is a Mechanigoff, a sneak peek at it at least. And finally, my course covers the same-ish variation as well, with f3. Now, this is quite different. If you recall back to the classical lines, where white castled bishop e2, knight f3, and castle kingside, and the main line after e5, d5 was to drop the knight back to e1, so I had to play f3 to support the e4 square. Here, white does that immediately. So he's preparing against the plan of e5, d5. Now, e5 is possible, but the dynamics are a bit different, and I don't like it so much. The problem is that white could also castle queenside here, and white keeps his big center. Instead, I prefer talking to this bishop, which sees yet more dark squares available, and playing castle, and we'll play c5 against most moves, activating this bishop, and we're transposed to a sort of Benoni position. Now, the overriding theme of the same-ish is white might have a nice center at the moment, but he's got a big problem with this knight on g1. The f3 pawn has simply taken away the most natural square. So he has e2, but both the bishop on f1 and the knight on g1 want the e2 square. So white takes a lot of time here to try and figure out how he's going to develop the bishop and knight successfully. A lot of the time, he simply fails. The main move is bishop e3. Bishop g5 is played from time to time too, but it's quite likely to transpose. We'll play in exactly the same way. With c5, and knight g2 is the main line. Knight c6. Now white should close the position really with d5. If he tries to hold a fluid center with queen d2, then queen a5 is annoying. If queen a5 was possible on the previous move, with the knight back on b8 and the queen back on d1, but there knight c1 works quite well. After cd, knight b3, the queen is attacked, sacrificing the queen with queen takes c3 check. If you think back to the position with queen still on d1 and now on b8, is fun but objectively unsound. So you drop the queen back, and if you are a accelerated dragon player and happy to face a Maroczy bind, then it's fine. But otherwise, you don't really want to go into Maroczy bind. Here, of course, it's not possible because we can take either bishop or knight, and the queen is hanging. So after queen a5, white has to do something else, and not knight c1. He has moves like castle queenside or rook c1 or rook d1, but these are very dangerous. It's probably better to play d5, but the addition after d5, knight e5, the addition of queen a5 and queen d2 is favouring us over the main lines. The d2 square actually could be used by white's knight when it hops around by g3 to f1 to d2. But here the queen is in the way, and we're very quick with our counterplay with a6, b5. Castle queenside tries to make use of the flexible center, but it's very risky. We just play for our attack on the queen side with a6. We're preparing b5, king b1, rook d8, another preparatory move. We couldn't play b5 immediately because the pawn was hanging on c5, but now after dc, the queen is attacked. So white decides to take, knight d5. I can see your opponent playing this and think he's got some small strategic advantage. The knight looks good. Maybe there's a hole on b6. White's got his solid structure. He's ready to bring his pieces out. But in fact, the position's extremely dangerous for white. After knight takes e5, the natural cd is already a big mistake. White has to exchange the queens, but here we're doing well. We attack the pawn on b2, and when the bishop drops back to c1, we've got a very powerful bishop on g7. If he goes b3, we'll hop back to d6 and exploit the pawn on b3 with some a5, a4, probably preceded by b5. Our attack is very strong, even without the queens on the board, as white is playing without that rook on h1 and bishop on f1 still. The overriding theme in the same-ish is this difficulty developing the bishop on f1. But what could be more natural than recapturing them with cd? But here we can have a great blow. Rook takes d5. Now queen takes, loses bishop e6. We're going to take on a2 next, and then b2. Let's just mate. So e takes, but now bishop f5, check. Welcome with tempo again. After king a1, knight b4. With threatening queen takes a2 mate, and knight c2 check is also winning a lot of material. White can't defend against both threats, and so it's game over. Amazing quite how quickly things went wrong for white. So the main move instead of queen d2 is immediate d5. And after knight e5, white has a choice. Going to g3 is considered more critical. If the knight goes back to c1, we can play e6, exchange on d5, and play for the b5 break with a6 and b5. After knight g3, I propose a different approach. It is still possible to play e6, but the knight on g3 is better placed. You get an interesting fight here. Our knight on e5 is very good, so white's whole plan is to kick it away. He'll do that by playing f4, but he can't do it immediately because it gives away control of the g4 square, so often he precedes it with h3. With the knight on g3, this plan seems to work for white. At least we probably have to give a piece as black if we just allow it with e6 and take an a6 and play as we would against knight c1. But we can exploit the downside of the knight on g3, and that's h5. Very interesting move there again. Now white could stop us going any further with h4, but then the problem is that whole plan of f4 doesn't work. We'll always have the g4 outpost, and if white can't kick our knight away from e5, then we're doing very well. It's really difficult for white to find any counterplay at all. So he probably just has to allow our plan and develop his bishop. h4, the knight goes back, and now we play our e6. We want an open e-file. And this is really the tabia of the entire same-ish variation. Here we'll look at the old main line. I'll just mention in passing that the most topical move at the elite level and correspondence now is bishop g5. Now this is the sharpest, and I'll offer two choices. Queen b6, getting out of the pin, is my principal try. I'll also investigate e takes d5. The lines are unnatural, and it's a bit of a weird move to play bishop g5, but white is trying to exploit the pin along the h4 to the diagonal, and that's why queen b6 is my main try. I don't think we've got any problems here. f4 is an old refutation of this line. So if you play someone who was well booked up 10 years ago, then he might consider f4 and go, oh yeah, this line isn't playable because of f4. Now the thing is, the knight can't really retreat to d7. We almost never want to retreat. But here, concretely, de, fe, queen takes d6 is very good. Knight g4 keeps material quality because we've got a trick after the swap of the ed5 and d4, but it's strategically very risky, giving away this outpost on d5, and I don't want to play it. Instead, in the game Svidla Grishuk Grishuk came up with a fantastic piece sacrifice of knight takes c4, bishop takes, and b5. Now, there's been a lot of play here in correspondence and at top level over the board chess, and it's concluded that we have fantastic compensation for the piece. And I think the position is just difficult for white. I can understand you being skeptical, but I can assure you that white's position is very difficult. The problem is really this knight on f1. We're going to open up the e-file when the knight is needed on f1, because otherwise the bishop on e3 is hanging. But if the knight stays on f1, white can't complete his development. His king's stuck in the middle, the rook out of place on h1, and it's just so difficult for white to coordinate. There are so many tricks that he's got to avoid, and even in correspondence chess, black is scoring fantastically here. So much so that they've stopped playing f4, really. But the main move is knight d2, and the most natural, this is the old main line. White's completing his odd journey for that knight, but now he's got his pieces to the correct squares, and he's got the idea of playing f4 finally and kicking our knight away. But we'll swap, and now h3 is an important move. Now, as I said, the plan is to play f4, so white's threatening h3 and f4. So we stop that ever being an idea. Now white should play g3 and take things slow, but it's still difficult for white. The problem is now that f4 is not really going to be a move because we always have knight eg4 with a very nice outpost, and white's probably just going to be left with a weak pawn on e4. He also had some problems with his king while we're ready to create further space and counterplay on the queen side with a6 and b5. This pawn break is powerful even as a pawn sacrifice in these positions. So g4 makes a lot of sense. The idea is to play g5, kicking our knight away from f6, and then f4, kicking our knight away from e5, and we're forced backwards and white might take over in the center. But there's a tactical flaw. We can take this. After f takes, take again. The thing is, if bishop takes g4, queen h4 check is very strong. Bishop f2 runs into knight d3 check. And if king f1 will take on g4, attack the bishop, and f5 is coming next. Our rook gets involved and all our pieces are attacking. White's just getting mated again or having to give up loads of material. So you should move the bishop. And the final important move to remember is bishop h6. This bishop can't be taken because queen h4 to f2 would now just be mate. Bishop g3 runs into knight e3, and that knight is very, very strong. It's quite similar to take on e5. And then we'll recapture. This knight dominates. We're throwing queen h4 mate. So knight f3 to cover it, but now b5 opens up the b file as well, where you play rook b8. White just can't play against that knight on e3, and so it might be a piece up, but is in a lot of trouble. So that is the main line of the same issue. We'll now look at a rare move, much rarer than bishop e3 and rarer than bishop g5 too, and that's knight ge2. But I imagine that this might become more topical and percolate down because white is experiencing difficulties in these old main lines with bishop e3. Now, the idea is that white is much more flexible. The normal way is playing exactly the same with c5 and e6, but now white plays knight g3, keeping the bishop on c1 for now. The point is that playing exactly the same way with h5, I've tried the Fischer-esque knight h5 in a couple of games, which is interesting, but obviously risky playing with doubled h-pawns. But here white has a couple of additional options. He can play bishop g5 in one go, stopping h4 for now, or simply bishop e2, allowing it, but the knight can come round to e3 now, which is a good square for the knight. So white's development is much smoother here than it is in the main line. Instead, I'd like to exploit this knight on e2, make it red, and play a6. Now, this line is still in its infancy, and it's going to catch your opponent off guard, but just seems incredibly straightforward to me. Our plan is to play b5, sacrificing a pawn. White will normally take it, we'll take back, knight takes, we'll hit the knight back with c6, and then we'll play knight bd7, e5, d5, opening up the center and exploiting the fact that white's king is still going to be trapped there. We'll have very active pieces, strong central control, and both an attack and long-term positional compensation. For example, bishop e3, b5, cb. Either, of course, are the alternatives for white 2 in the full repertoire. We take c6. It's actually knight d7 here immediately, and then playing b5 next is more common. But I find it easier just to play b5 consistently against everything. But the knight d7 move order is also good. So exchange, we play our plan. Knight d7, we're ready to play e5 next. And notice that white still has this problem with his king. It's going to take 1, 2, 3 moves to get his king to safety. Now queen d2 is actually the most common move, as well as the fact that we might have played knight d7, queen d2, and then b5. So this position has been reached in quite a few games, but it doesn't alter our plan. e5. Now the most common move is actually d takes e5, but this is misguided. All it's doing is activating our knight on d7, but it doesn't alter our plan. Here we're going to play d5 against virtually anything. If white puts his knight on g3, then as well as d5, we also have ideas of h5, h4 again. We saw that this was annoying white already. It's the same theme. We'll also attack white's weakened kingside when he castles kingside, pushing that pawn to h3, just creating further weaknesses. Once we take on e4 after d5, de, if we've got a pawn on h3, we'll have a fantastic outpost on g4 as well. So white captures, but now he's got to watch out for knight c4. Now knight d4 is the most natural, but not a good square at all. f4 is the worst of the choices, because after g5, there's just not a square. If it goes back to h3, we'll just take it. If g takes, knight takes f3, check. It's embarrassing, so he has to go back to e2 or d3, and that allows knight c4. We get rid of the dark square bishop, and we're still attacking in the center. Objectively, the best square is g3, but we play h5 again. Just remind that knight that it's not safe on g3. White can go h4 to stop h4 happening ourselves, but white's still a few tempi away from castling. And now even when he does, the h4 pawn is going to be vulnerable, as is a knight on g3. They're both a bit loose. So we've got very good compensation for the pawn here. Knight d4, we're following a game of Karen Grigoryan, who was rated 2666, a huge rating, when he was white playing a 2379 player, Garida Uton. But we'll see that there should have been some giant killing going on here. d5, we continue the plan. Now the problem with the knight on d4 is we threaten c5 and d4, winning a piece. So white has to react. Taking has been white's most frequent try, but we'll just take with the knight, opening up yet more lines. The bishop is involved too. We have just all our pieces in the attack, and white's still got problems with his king, and some problems with bishop on e3 as well. Bishop f4, queen e7 is not helping either. So he tried f4, which I guess is the most forcing, moving our knight away. After knight eg4, e5, we're still following that game. But had black found c5 here, he'd been well on his way to a memorable scalp. White is actually just busted here. His position is too loose. It's messy with all the pieces hanging for both sides, but the overriding problem is that white has tarried too long and hasn't castled. For example, e takes f6, loses to knight takes e3, and after taking the bishop, rook e8, I've just got too many threats. We're threatening to take the knight on d4, but the main idea is just discover checks. For example, knight c4 check, picks up the queen. The only way to defend both threats is knight e2, but now d4. We're threatening the knight on c3, but that's somewhat incidental. More important is the threat of d3 when there's knight c2 check, but there's also knight c4 attacking the queen, and if it moves, d2 check is just going to be winning. If the queen had gone to c1, it picks up the queen, and otherwise our queen will be able to come in to d3 and e3 mate. Sorry for too many arrows, but hopefully you understand. So white could try knight c6 instead, but now after queen c7, ef, bishop takes, we're going to regain the piece with d4. White's king is still stuck. Okay, you could go queenside, but that's out of the frying pan into the fire. So d4 happens, we regain the piece, and white's just lost. So here you've seen a brief highlight reel of the lifetime repertoire. And if you're interested, please do go over there and consider purchasing the course. Lifetime Repertoire, King's Indian Defense, Part 1. Finally, we'll finish with a bonus game. Now, this is one of the model games from the Lifetime Repertoire between Georgi Kakiashvili and Sergei Movsesian from the 2003 European Club Cup. Now, White was rated over 2600 when he played this game, but barely survived the opening, losing horribly. We'll jump right in. All so far, so normal, and an h3 King's Indian. Now, this is quite topical, but I think it's actually very difficult for White to play. He's playing for total control, trying to stifle us and prevent our breaks. But if we do succeed in the breaks, then White's king is often wildly exposed. It's after all playing with fire to delay your development with pawn moves. So far, so normal. Bishop g5, knight a6. And the move order now leaves something to be desired. The normal move order to reach the position that we reach in the game would be g4, bishop d7, preparing c6 and perhaps a4, knight d2 and c6. And this is the move order I recommend in the Lifetime Repertoire. Instead, after knight d2, I recommend just getting out of the pin immediately with queen e8, followed by knight d7 to c5 and play for f5. This normal break. If you recall, we had that strong pawn sacrifice. Sergei instead went c6, but I don't like playing c6 too early. If White still has a pawn on g2, I'm a bit concerned that White might switch back to simply castling kingside when we don't really want to touch the queenside. After all, if White castles kingside, we are playing for the f5 break and going to mate him on the kingside, while White is playing for counterplay on the queenside. If that's the case, we don't want to touch the queenside. But the game soon reaches charted waters once again after g4, which is probably inaccurate here. We get another funny interlude here with queen b6, queen hit and back again. But after bishop d7, we're now back into my proposed repertoire. Now, probably bishop e2 is the most sensible move when we transpose back into Petrosian lines. And rook g1 is also interesting. White instead tries to exploit the fact that his bishop is still on f1 with queen f3, putting pressure on our knight on f6. The problem is that White can't increase the pressure, and so the queen is actually rather misplaced here, as we'll see. Sergei Movsesian now played a very strong pawn sacrifice, a4, which shouldn't really be taken. It is, but we'll see the big problems. It was better to play a3, but still, after knight c5, we've definitely gained something. White's never able to play b4 anymore. We've got a very good outpost for the knight. Now to castle queenside, rook b8. I'm not sure what White's idea is. We'll take on d5 and play b5, b4. And it's clear that White's king is very vulnerable, but I don't know how he's getting his counterplay over on the king side here. Still, this would be better than the game. White took on a4. I think what he was hoping for was cd5, knight c3, with ideas of knight d5 with some pressure on the long on the h4 to d8 diagonal with this bishop on g5. But we don't need to take back our pawn. Instead, h6 was very strong. Now, if the bishop retreats, then we'll take on d5, and White doesn't even have the pin, so it's obliged to give up this bishop. But if I told you to exchange off your dark square bishop and then put your pawns on the worst possible squares, you'd be hard done to do better than this. The pawns on h3, g4, we probably should make them red, e4, d5, and c4 are all on the same color as this bishop on f1, blocking it in. And in the meantime, we have a wonderful dark square bishop. Bishop going to g5, there's one big outpost on f4. White's king is also very miserable now. Castling kingside is never going to be safe, as that g-pawn can't go backwards. And as we can see, queenside won't help either. C takes d5 is a threat now, regaining the pawn. So knight had to return to c3. And now we isolate the bishop. And black's already doing extremely well. Not only do we have good squares for our pieces, open lines, and easy play on the queen side, but White's pieces just can't coordinate. The bishop is terrible on f1, the knight on d2 can't go anywhere. Useful, the queen is in the way, and it takes White too long to get anywhere. In fact, even if he got in h4, it wouldn't help him very much because we would be able to keep the kingside closed. He tried castle queenside, but this is just out of the frying pan and into the fire. It's a very, very risky move. Clearly, we already have the bishop pointing that way. We have an open A file where it can open up the C file with CD. The queen is coming in. And after B5, white is already lost. It's only 18 moves and white is a 2600 player. So it's amazing quite how badly things can go when they go wrong for white in the King's Indian. Now, there was another game where white stumbled into this position too, and he didn't last any longer. He took immediately, but black's moves are very straightforward. Now, this kind of position would be a very good Benko gambit. If white's king were over on G2, we'd have very good counterplay on the queen side, with pressure down the B and A files. A good square on C5 for our knight to hop into a strong bishop on G5. But with white's king on C1, it's already just the end of the game. There's no way to defend against the might of our entire army. B3 is necessary, but now the queen came in. It can't be shifted away because of the pin, so the knight on D2. Tried H4, but rook C8. Bishop doesn't need to move yet. Rook takes C3 is a big threat. So I tried defending with rook H3, but the knight came in. Now knight takes A2, exploiting the pin is a threat. And after king B1, took anyway, and white resigned. He's going to get mated here. If he takes on A2, we can simply take with the rook, followed by checking with the other one. Instead, Gakiashvili chose king B1, getting out of that pin, but it didn't really help him. Movdesian simply improved his knight, and the threat is B4, forcing that knight to go backwards. Knight B5 will run into queen A5, forking the knight and the A2 pawn. So he didn't see anything better than taking the pawn anyway. But clearly with the two open files here, there's just far, far too much pressure on white's position. He tried knight B3, giving one pawn back to exchange off one of our attacking pieces, but it wasn't enough. The exchange, king C2, trying to get out of the pin. We attack the pawn, are in the way to defend its rook B1. And finally, a pretty finish, rook A2, increasing the pressure on the pawn on B2 and exploiting the pin along the third rank to the queen. As you can see, playing queen F3 did not help white in the slightest, and in fact, white loses the game because of this idea. Now, I can't think of much better advert for the line than this. White tried to play a trendy line, this H3 Mechanigoff system, but got mixed up very fast and lost without a fight, even though he was a very strong grandmaster. I hope that this short and sweet has inspired you, and hope to see you over at the Lifetime Repertoire King's India Defence Part 1 very soon. Thanks for watching. Bye.